I was looking for a title that would somehow bring together a sort of a multiplicity, because I think at the moment we're not looking at a very singular moment in art. I think this is a time in which there are a variety of things going on, and with the Biennale of Sydney there are also a variety of venues that one is asked to use. And so for me, I felt a theme as such, you know, is not exactly right, because you could be in a position where you keep just repeating that theme, answering that you know, thematic premise time and time again, and so it sort of shrinks it down. I wanted to, you know, enlarge it, keep it open, but also use the opportunity of each of the venues, which to me have different sort of building qualities, sort of spatial stock, if you like, and use those in a variety of ways too. So I was looking for a title that would be evocative, but perhaps actually said something about the artistic procedure. And so I think ultimately I wanted to find some way of indicating a motivation, an artistic motivation, and I do think that that is in the combination of imagination and desire. And philosophically I think it always has been thus to some degree. So for me, imagination is that capacity that one has, persons have, to think about possibility, to think forward, maybe to predict action or event. And then the desiring part of that is the motivation to do it, is actually the thing that puts it in train, puts it in play, and actuates it in some way. So I was looking to bring those two types of ideas together, and then I found that many philosophers had actually talked about such a thing, and I found that quote from George Bernard Shaw, which was a ready-made title for me. I took away the first part, which was imagination is the first part of creativity, because I thought that was too specific, and I left aside the following quotes, and I took the second moment of it, which was you imagine what you desire, which I think leaves it open and provides a kind of helix, if you like. And the other part of that was I was trying to think of ways in which I could bring art and audiences together. So for me, of course, I think there is a meeting of desire and the artistic imagination. I think there is a meeting of the visitor's imagination and the desiring of the artist too. So I wanted to bring those two things into play as well. I also liked the conundrum of the title and the way in which it perhaps asks a question within its own statement. Do we desire first in order to imagine, or do we imagine in order to desire? Or, you know, it's a complex procedure. And many philosophers actually tried to grapple with that as well. So yes, I wanted to set in play, I suppose, that idea, and then to using the building stock available to me, the different types of spaces that were available to me, bring a set of ensemble elements together to perform the function of the full Biennale.
How have you, in terms of ensembles of artworks and then how to kind of treat the sites for the audiences, if you could talk us through how you've treated each particular site?
And it's very exciting to be able to use different types of spaces. In the Biennale of Sydney, of course, there is the tremendous opportunity that's offered by using the space at Cockatoo Island. When I say a tremendous opportunity, it's an opportunity that comes with some great demands, and it doesn't permit certain things. For a start, it's a wild, feral kind of place. It's an unruly kind of place, and it already has a number of very demonstrative characteristics. Its terrain is very rugged. Its geography is very tough. Its space is dauntingly large, and the buildings, which are a higgle-piggle of all sorts of things, are also either very large in scale or a little bit unforgiving in their environments. It's dirty, you know, it's open to the elements, and so you can't put particularly precious things out there. But it is a heart and mind space, I think. People really have enjoyed the Biennale being out on the island, and I certainly noticed when I was thinking through what to do with the space, that it was a place, a destination to which many family groups came, not just people looking for art, but people looking in a sense for an experience, people who are curious maybe, and maybe even day trippers who perhaps don't even know that art is there. So for me that was an interesting idea to think about how I might make some use of those existing propositions of the space and the existing preconditions of the space. And I determined that I would try, if I could, to put some energy into it, make it even more feral than it perhaps already is. Use the sculptural element of the space and reiterate that somewhat through art. So I built a system of kinetic sculptural works in the lower system of the space, in the turbine hall, which reference in some ways the physical labour that has preceded the Biennale's inhabitation of the space, the physical labour that was there from convict times through the reformatory school times to the shipbuilding times, and try in some ways to use that existing history and build it back into those works. I wanted to also release energy in other ways and release some elemental energy into it, so I put the waterfall in, which flows and makes a great sound throughout that whole bottom system. And I wanted to make some works that were sort of in scale, somewhat in sympathy, or at least, you know, could be held within the space and, you know, hold their own, as it were. So I wanted to build, for instance, something like the village, which is an environment within an environment, and started off as a kind of sweet centre of a space and go to a slightly bitter edge with the island. And so it starts off quite, you know, imaginistically and almost fantasy-like in certain ways, and as we grow out from that space and go up, it becomes spookier or deeper, darker. Yeah, so I saw it as a sort of set of different terrains that we could use. And I think that's working quite well. I mean, it's intentionally there for audiences. It's intentionally requiring a people to come to it and to activate it. It really works for a people. So that's what I wanted to do on the island. And it's a free-form space in certain ways. It's also, an island is a kind of trope for me. It's a place, it's a destination. You imagine it forward. You don't know what you will find on an island, and that's especially the case for anyone who's never been here before. So a lot of the international people who were here for the first time were curious about what is the island. You know, for them it's palm trees and things like that. They don't necessarily anticipate it's going to be an industrial ruin of a space, but when they get to it, it's tremendously exciting. Just its own characteristic is very demonstrable. So, you know, that was also part of my thinking, that the island is a destination. You go to it with some anticipation. It could be either a utopian space, as it is in literature, or a dystopian space, as it often is in cinema. So all of those things play out. With the MCA space, because of its proximity to water obviously, but also its newer architecture, and because they've actually de-blunted some of the walls in the renovation, I felt it was a lighter sort of space. Regular, because of course it's a museum style space, but slightly lighter on its feet, and so I conceived of the MCA space as a air-water sort of space. And for me, air suggests the mentality. You know, it's the sort of the mind. It's like Socrates going up into the clouds. You know, so I thought of that as being the space that I would put my more psychological kind of works in. And when you think of psychology, for me anyway, maybe other people are different, but I almost immediately think of surrealism, and I start to think of those spaces that are created in the mind through collage means and things of this kind too. So I determined that I would bring water and air into this space in a variety of ways. So I travel the water from the island, which has been released in the waterfall, and I bring that into the ground, into the first level through Pipilotti Wrist, and so that sort of sets in train then an encounter that's aesthetically drawn through the space, where water flows, where crazy goes, where colour flows again, where we see the surreal language, you know, unfurl. A lament, a quiet passage, you know, a stillness in Ronnie Horn, etc. So to me, I wanted to create that kind of aesthetic journey, and along that journey pick up some of those art historical references and some of those things that I think are still very volatile within the sort of delivery of visual art at the moment. I mean, it's very interesting to me how collage is so prominent at this time. I don't just mean the kind of collage works of, say, someone like John Steziker, which is very straightforwardly done. I mean the collage space that we're seeing now in filmic works, in the digital world, in the propositions of time and space that we're seeing here. Someone even like David Clairbout, which appears a rather straightforward piece, is really mucking around with time and space and close and far. You know, it's a very collaged, you know, kind of environment. Still, though, it seems it's highly sophisticated in its many angles and incidents.
And installation as well.
Yeah, absolutely, exactly. And then at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, well, that's a that's a very low space, you know, kind of a bit of a bunker kind of space. I thought, well, if I've thought about the air-water things in the MCA, then the proposition here would probably be more earth-fire. So I conceived of that as a more Promethean space, and when I say that, what I mean is that calling upon the myth of Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods in order to give it to humankind so it would be self-determining. It would be my social space in many ways, and so it's a congress kind of space. It's a space in which society develops and imagines itself forward, hopefully to a better constitution of, you know, societal self, where we share stories and where we're in aspects of transformation. So there, fire and earth is seen in a variety of different ways. Fire, which is picked up from Pippi and taken like a sort of beacon along to the art gallery, which we then see, you know, reflected in the works of people like Mircea Cantor, and the water, which is still there in the work of Whale Shakwi. But now we are talking about more anthropological stories, humankind, which for me I think was important to place within the State Gallery. To me, that authoritarian space in some ways, that place where we, you know, gather our human archive. It was important to me that perhaps that was, you know, descriptively the most socially active of the spaces in terms of the construct of our society now and what it will become. Carriageworks was then offered to me as a venue, and well, I'd done my earth, fire, and I'd done my water, air, and I'd done my feral wild, so I thought, well, what can I do with Carriageworks? But because it's had a recent history of being a film studio for the Kennedy Miller people, I thought, well, actually it's quite an ideal to perhaps think of it really as that, as both a cinema and theatre space, since it lives, you know, with that genre of work out there. And I thought, well, in fact, I've seen of late quite a lot of works from artists who are working within the either moving image medium or sculpturally, who are, I think, looking at the language of cinema, distilling it, you know, extracting from it those things that were put into it by art in the first place. So here we see animation come into the picture, again another form of collaging, which has, you know, been used by the Disney animators for many years. We're seeing now small vignettes of stories and narratives that are extracted from, you know, cinema films and replayed through the kind of idea of the art bubble. We're seeing, you know, works such as Matthias Perlender's work, which actually gives us the opportunity to concentrate very much on the decadence of, you know, Hollywood filmmaking, you know, the very elaborate amount of skill and work that goes into essentially a sort of little confectionery. So all of these things I thought were very interesting to put out there, and I conceived of the space as sort of like a cinema box. So it's quite dark, and you go into it, and then I've placed in the midst of that Gabriel Lester's three-dimensional project, which almost is like you're in the film set. So, you know, those languages I think were there to be sort of excavated. And of course the techniques now, the way in which artists are able to use this high-level filming techniques through, you know, new technologies is simply amazing, and we're seeing exceptional qualities coming as a result of that. And, you know, we're also seeing, I think, a delicious return to some gorgeous landscape painting and portraiture, but through video. So a lot of those people who started life as painters have actually transited to moving image, and now the delectable quality of these video works are just like literally outstanding. They're marvellous, the clarity of them, the colour of them, beautiful. So, you know, I conceived of that space that way, and because I'd wanted to regather Artspace into the fold, I had some works that I felt somehow collected, you know, the ether and put it back together. And I put Ugo Rondinoni's Primitive, which is 59 little bird sculptures, on the floor there, in concert with Maxime Rossi's wonderful work, which has been made by birds, a lovely collision of Cagean strategy, of chance and Chopin, and some other things there that are, you know, my flights of fancy. It's where I like the idea that perhaps the birds represent all of the works and the qualities and the aesthetics of all of the other places, and they perhaps come together finally, because of course they're named after things like landscapes and waterfalls and floods and sun and moon and all of those things we've been looking at aesthetically in lots of the other spaces. So it's a little gem of a space. It's sort of like a little full stop, or perhaps it's a little overture to the things. Depends how you go and what your itinerary is. And, you know, of course, we also had some work out in the public domain, because I think at the moment artists are very much in search of an audience, and they don't necessarily expect that audience will always come to them. Sometimes they wish to engage with an audience that don't expect them to be there. And yesterday we had a wonderful performance with Egle's choreography for the Mail, which took place from the Art Gallery of New South Wales and went down and ran around Woolloomooloo. And it was highly entertaining to have many people come out of their houses and go, "What's happening?" And you say, "Oh, it's art." They go, "Oh, okay." So that was really good. And yeah, an excellent project that takes itself to the people, not necessarily beckoning the people to it.
I think maybe that's a good point, talking about taking things to the people. The ideas of the Art Gallery of New South Wales as being this social kind of oriented space, and the MCA being this kind of psychological one, really resonates with what I'm interested in. So maybe we can talk about the MCA idea of mentality and the psychological, and that idea of desire.
Well, desire, you know, Aristotle was the first person really to bring imagination and desire together. He was trying to figure out, you know, how imagination could be activated. And he saw it as a form of kind of animal locomotion, really. So if you put a piece of bread there and an animal is hungry, it will want to go to it. But I think now we have a slightly more sophisticated sense of desire. Desire is that thing that makes us compels us to actually try to achieve or actualize something. And I think that really is actually at the heart of the artistic enterprise. An artist conceives of something in their mind's eye, as you would, thinks of an idea and wants to fulfill that idea by actualizing it, bringing it into being, no matter how that happens, whether that's even without visuality. They have a procedure that they employ, a kind of amorous pursuit of this idea. And I think that lives at the very heart of the whole artistic approach. And I think it's, you know, embedded almost really in everything that we see at the MCA, but you know, in all of the other venues too. I mean, it is the principal motor that actually compels people to make something that, you know, really society doesn't need, nor is it really seeking, doesn't, you know, kind of feed it or whatever. But nevertheless, for me, is, you know, highly valuable. A highly necessary thing for a society to have within itself, this reflection of itself, which is, you know, created through the artist's mind, through the active philosophy of the artist, which, you know, uses its materiality or its procedure to actually think through its time and its making. Because art comes from its time. Art is always, you know, a product of its time. And so artists, you know, are inclined to be thinking about the times in which they live. They do that through metaphor, they do that through poetry, they do that through less didactic means than, say, you know, politics or economics. They're almost a parallel kind of commentary, or a para-commentary on what is happening. And they're often very far-sighted and foresighted. They often see it before it happens. So it's quite interesting to me that, you know, artists will often see what has been discarded by society and recognise almost quickly its necessary rehabilitation back into, you know, something through art. So we see, for instance, you know, discarded bits and pieces in Garner and York, or we see Tacita Dean using film. You know, these things that are disappearing from our lives, our sites, which still have, you know, much that they can contribute to us. I think this is also a quite anthropological sort of approach that artists use. They don't do it knowingly. It's just a part of that procedure that they have inherently inside themselves, that they feel it beforehand. They're sort of like the canaries in the coal mine. You know, they sort of can predict through their own efforts, through their own processes, that which we need, or that which we're going to need soon. Or they understand what it is we don't have, and they put it there. Or they understand, you know, the way in which visuality changes and how they have to reintroduce or subtract certain things at certain times. So at the moment we're living in a time which is quite brittle visually in our common life. You know, we're very screen-based, we're very pixelated, it's very frontal. It comes as no real surprise to me, therefore, that so many artists are interested in deep time, you know, collage time, trying to actually reposition time and space phenomenologically again. I think it's very interesting. We don't know that they're doing that necessarily. That takes some time to actually see that in the works, but that's what they are providing to us because they know that actually we need it. It's the same reason that they've actually been working with installation for a period of time and making immersive spaces. They know that our bodies need to be in something, that we've got this very frontal, brittle kind of life that we're living often, and we need a sort of resensuous passage that we can actually feel our bodies in and that we can think through and have repose in. So a lot of those strategies, I think, are inherently in the amorous procedure, which is the art project.
I'm really drawn to the idea of the poetic, but that poetic way of kind of the artist or the poet helping us through the traumatic time, or kind of telling the story through poetry or through the artistic lens.
Yeah.
Solves the social trauma, or it helps us kind of cope with it.
That's right, but I don't think artists generally do this prescriptively or even deliberately. I think the best ones tend to do it intuitively, and for me, I prefer the poetic approach than the didactic approach. I think when it's very didactic, if it's just preaching to you or telling you something, then you know, it will agree with 50% of the people who agree with it, and it will be less meaningful for others who don't share that point of view. Whereas if you have metaphor, poetry, those languages of art, the ideas are embedded in the thing, and people can find their way into it through the layers and through the variety of, you know, other approaches and tactics that artists are using to lure people to those ideas. And more often than not, people stay with that rather than retreat from it. And I think that's an important thing too.
Well, I think maybe that's a good point to talk about the social aspect of the Biennale as well. And I think, I don't know, I was reading the other day that the Belgiano Netties are the, you know, the true Medicis or something like that. And a line like that has, you know, is a problematic one.
Well, they're not the true Medicis, obviously that's the Medici.
Yes, exactly.
That's just one of those funny things that people say when they don't really realise they're saying something's really stupid.
Yeah. But it makes me think that obviously cultural production always has its own masters, or its various masters, and sometimes they're personal.
Do you mean patron masters?
I mean, in all senses. So it's a personal master.
You mean a master-slave master?
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
How, I mean, in this context, have you negotiated? I mean, I know it's a late coming, but originally, when you were thinking about the idea of imagination and desire, there already is this equation between audience and artwork and society, artist and society. Maybe if you could talk to us with how you originally navigated that role, and then how you've kind of come to be looking at that navigation now.
Yeah, I think we need to be cautious about not retrofitting an issue that came very, very late to this Biennale, and trying to make the Biennale fit to that new lens precisely. But I will say this, it is already very much a part of the construct of the statement. You imagine what you desire. That it assumes that artists and audiences alike, together, all of us, society, are hoping to imagine possibility and potential and see something forward. And that is part of the way we evolutionise our society. And artists are very much, I think, at the avant-garde of that. They always have been. And so that's the reason why, in a quite prescient sort of way, I already had quite a lot of works in this exhibition, which I think, perhaps slightly more subtly, were addressing some of the key issues of our moment, and certainly one of those key issues is the asylum seeker issue here in Australia and elsewhere too. As I've said, you know, in press recently, the construction of, say, the Danish village on Cockatoo Island is, I mean, of course, it's a fantasy space, it's a childlike environment, it has that purpose too for the family groups who go out there, but it also is a fortress. And, you know, 4 months ago I wrote in the catalogue precisely that it can be seen also as a metaphor for a community that is keeping itself intact, excluding others from it. It is a militarist kind of strategy. So those things were always lurking there in a lot of the works, as they would, because art comes from its time. It's not divorced from the conditions of its making and the society in which it's made. So, you know, it's in everything in many ways, and protests too, you know, featured quite a lot in the Biennale. Happy protests, alchemical protests in the case of the photo works of Nathan Coley. You know, they were already kind of part of the structure of thinking in many ways. Xiao's, you know, shot through pieces of glass, you know, there's rupture. Because I think we are at a time in society where we're hopeful for change. We're seeing change being attempted around the world. You know, the Arab Spring, the uprisings in the Ukraine of late. All of these are moving towards something. We're not quite sure what that something actually is at this point, but there's a sense, I think, that there is agitation around the world. I'd like to think that that's a positive agitation, you know, purposefully moving towards something, but it hasn't coalesced yet. We're not quite sure. That moment hasn't really arrived yet. And I think artists are very sensitive to that. Susan Norrie is sensitive to, you know, the public demonstrations and uprisings in Japan, a society we don't associate with anti-authoritarian behaviour. But for them, you know, the intolerable situation of nuclear power, which has had such destructive results in their society of late, is something that they feel they must protest against. So we're seeing a kind of common societal gathering, hoping for positive change, hoping for something else to happen. And, you know, even paradoxically returning perhaps to places that you would think that, you know, people would not wish to return to. You know, the fact that the Crimea wants to rejoin with the Soviet, with Russia. I mean, it's just very interesting. So, you know, it's society is in flux, and I think artists are very good at sensing that. They're like super sensitive to that, and they evolve that out into their art in a variety of ways.
Thinking about the shot through glass, I think, because that is such a it's a beautiful image,
yeah,
and it's facing the Edward Said quote, ironically the anonymous Edward Said quote.
It's not ironic, I put it there deliberately.
Yeah, no, but that you could have an anonymous quote by an artist, by a person. That's the irony, I guess. How do you feel as a curator, as someone who's put so much, like just the sheer amount of labour that goes into a project like this, having it not co-opted, but so quickly and thoroughly inserted into a bunch of other conversations?
Well, you know, as I say, I think that a lot of those issues were already in the Biennale, and so the Biennale can absorb some of that, of course. I'm not suggesting for a minute that it wasn't quite a difficult few weeks actually for the Biennale, but in many ways it was more disruptive in terms of some of the things that we'd put in place, you know, some of our operations and things of this sort. For me personally, you know, it was a very time-consuming and unsettling time, because I had to well, first of all, find my own ethical position within the whole discussion. I had to try as much as I could to help all of the artists, no matter what their proposition was or what their position was or what their decision was. I said right from day one I would support them all, as I think is important to do as a curator. You must listen, and it's not easy, I think, for an artist to make a decision to withdraw from something that they've been working toward for 2 years, 16 months or something like that. That was hard for a lot of those people. So I had to also, I think, be there to listen and give support in that way as well. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the telephone internationally and writing to each individual artist and to them collectively to just try and find out what it was they wanted to do and how we could come together. What I was very concerned about overall was that art was not seen to be powerless, that at the end of the day the voice of the artist is actually strong, and that the collective voice is strong, and that that the artists could continue to trust what they had already done. Many of them felt, I think, disappointed in themselves that perhaps they weren't making overtly political work, but they didn't, and that was not what their project was 16 months leading up to the event. So to try and help them also understand that their art was already very powerful, and that they should trust that art and make use of this opportunity in a positive kind of way. And of course, with the resignation of Luca and the separation of the Biennale from its founding sponsor Transfield, almost bar two, all of the artists who had withdrawn came back. So, and that was pretty instant. So it's been very interesting. It's not intolerable to me. I mean, I think the thing is that it was already in the art, and it was already in the proposition, and so you absorb it.